Well, hello to my viewer. It's nice to be with you. I appreciate the chance. What a difference a month makes. Last month, after we talked about the church's position and lack of a position on many points on evolutionary biology, someone said to me afterwards, so how do you understand Genesis? First couple chapters of Genesis then. And I said, well, we'll maybe talk about that next time. So this is going to be a bit different than what we've done before. The ones we've done before, I've tried to adjust questions that people might have about church history or respond to attacks that people make against the church or the gospel it teaches or its leaders. So today I want to just kind of maybe step back. I hope it'll be an edifying thing and a way to maybe look at the bigger picture. When we talk about the concerns that people have about the church or the gospel, sometimes the biggest problem that they have, and it's the thing that takes the biggest amount of work and effort and time to overcome, is the assumptions that they bring to the question. Our assumptions grind the lenses, if you will, through which we see things. And we're usually not aware of our assumptions because we assume them. You look through lenses, you don't notice the lens until it becomes so dirty that you can't see through it. And then you need to clean them or replace them, and you'll see better. So what I want to talk about tonight is the creation accounts that we have in the scriptures and in the temple endowment, and how an ancient Israelite, to whom those accounts were first given, would have understood them. How do their lenses, their assumptions, change what you and I might see if we trade their lenses for ours? And hopefully this won't be just about this. This will be about a way of approaching things that might trouble you. And the next time you're troubled about something, I hope one of the things that you will pause and step back and ask and say, what assumptions am I making? And are those assumptions correct? Out of respect for the temple, I will not quote temple language or the things that go on there, except in very, very general terms. I'm going to start, not sure why that did that. I'm going to start by saying that I'm not an expert in this stuff. I'm not a professional. This is not my domain. I'm an amateur. I'm an interested onlooker. I dabble on the shoreline while other people play out in the waves and surf. But even from the shore, you can sometimes see things that are interesting, and it feels kind of good to get your toes wet. A lot of what I say today is by this man. He's a well-recognized, he's a Christian, not a member of our faith. He's a well-recognized Old Testament scholar. He's been the editor of a variety of scholarly books. And anyway, there's two books in particular. They're both about the same sort of thing. The one in the bottom is kind of the more technical version, and then the one up top, The Lost World of Genesis 1, is his more popular version. If you're interested in this stuff, I would recommend either of those books to you. So Hugh Nibley, a scholar of the last generation of the church, used to say, the temple is a scale model of the universe for the purpose of taking our bearings on the universe. Well, all models are incomplete in some way. They focus on what the model wishes to emphasize. A street map of Paris, which you see here, I mean, that tower is way out of scale for starters, but that's something that every tourist wants to find in Paris, is the Eiffel Tower. When I was a missionary there, we used to navigate by it. We'd look around, where's the tower, and then we'd know where we were. So this is a tourist map, and it's very useful if you're a tourist. But what it doesn't show you is how the land rises and falls. If you looked at the top map, you would never know that there were differences in elevation and stairs. But that's okay, because a tourist doesn't mind going up and down a couple hills, but he's going to be very upset if the thing he came to see isn't there. Or, to use another example, you might have a model of a car that's smaller than the real thing for convenience. Remember, a perfect model is never much use because it would be the exact same size and the exact same shape and have all the features of the thing that you're trying to model. And we create models because we have problems coping with the big thing. A map the size of Paris itself might be precisely accurate, but it's not much good. But by the same token, you can't stand on a map and be in the literal Paris. You have to pick one or the other. So, what aspects of the universe, of the cosmos, is the temple and the scriptural texts that talk about these same things trying to model for us? Well, in our culture, since the rise of science, which started, in the 1600s and accelerated since then, many people have sought to use the book of Genesis as a type of science textbook. And if we can't make Genesis tell us how the world was created, with the physical structure of the earth and the Big Bang and the solar system and all that, the assumption goes, well, then it must be false, and the Bible must be false along with it. And what's strange is that many believers in the Bible have been just as anxious as atheists and critics to work with that assumption. That has led to all sorts of problems and foolishness in science classrooms and elsewhere. And even in the church, we've not been immune to some of that. Though the temple ceremony, which we're told is symbolic, maybe should have made us more cautious. There were three psychologists at the University of British Columbia, and they published a paper about 10 years ago called, quote, "The Weirdest People in the World." What they point out is that most of the research that's been done and most of what we know about psychology and economics and social science and cognitive science comes from a study of what they call the weird culture. And that is us. We are weird. We are Western, educated by and large. We're all literate. We all can do math. We all have multiple years of education. That's a really rare thing in the world or in history. Industrialized, rich, we're all rich by any standard, modern or ancient, and democratic, we're very individualistic. That's our culture. But no culture like ours has ever existed on Earth before, and ours is really only about a century old, and our predecessors go back a few hundred years at most. Think, for example, of the U.S. Founding Fathers. They set up a basis for a lot of what we think of as the modern weird culture. But even many of them had slaves and didn't see anything wrong with that. And the slaves certainly weren't part of the weird culture. So this is new. So I say all that to say that if you try to read an ancient text like the Old Testament from the standpoint of the weird culture, with the weird lenses, the weird assumptions, you are going to end up with weird results. What do you think is more likely? That the Lord spoke to a bunch of Bronze Age people 3,000-4,000 years ago, and told them things that they would only really be able to understand once they had modern 21st century science? Does that seem plausible to you? Or is it more likely that the Lord spoke to them in their language and in their idiom and according to their understanding of the world? Well, he tells us in the Doctrine and Covenants that the commandments he gave to Joseph Smith, he said, quote, "These commandments are of me, and they were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding." Close quote. So I expect if he did that for us, he would do it for others of his children. So I'm going to turn now to this John Walton guy, this scholar. He says this: all of this demonstrates the radical contrast between the terms in which the Israelites thought about cosmic origins and the terms in which we think about them. When we ask, how does the cosmos work, we seek an answer that discusses physical laws and structures. In our cognitive environment, that is in our culture, our weird culture, function is a consequence of physical properties and natural laws, and a discussion of creation therefore must, of course, direct itself to the making of things, how things are made. Oh, we lost our signal. Okay. And we're back. Okay. In contrast, he continues, when the Israelites asked, how does the cosmos work? They sought a totally different answer, because in the ancient worldview, function is a consequence of purpose. Thus, the Israelites can be seen to have the same functional approach to creation as is evident in the ancient Near East. In science culture, then, we ask, how did the physical structure of the universe come to be? How did species arise? But since the eclipse of Aristotle's philosophy and his cosmology, we in the West have taken what's called teleology, which means purpose. We've taken purpose out of our scientific explanations. The reason that two planets attract each other, There's no reason for that. That's just how they are. Gravity just does it, and that's all we care about. It's all we talk about. We want an equation to describe how they will interact. We don't worry about why this happens or what the purpose in a greater scheme is. But in an ancient culture, how did the universe come to serve its purpose was their question. So trying to read Genesis about the creation of physical things isn't so much wrong as it is irrelevant. Later Christians came to believe in something called creatio ex nihilo, which is a Latin phrase that means creation out of nothing. But Genesis says nothing about where the material that went into creation came from. But Genesis and the temple tell us quite a different story than creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. In the temple, the creation starts out with matter unorganized. We aren't told where the matter came from, and in a sense it doesn't really matter, pun intended, because that isn't the point of the model. Instead, we're told what God is going to do with the matter, what its purpose is. And this sort of thing you can see very clearly in our own scriptures. If you turn to Abraham, chapter 3, this is God discussing the creation, planning it. He says, quote, "We will go down, for there's space there, and we'll take of these materials," that matter, "and we'll make an earth whereupon these may dwell, and we will prove them herewith to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. And they who keep their first estate shall be added upon, and they who keep not their first estate shall not have glory in the same kingdom with those who keep their first estate. And they who keep their second estate shall have glory added upon their heads forever and ever." So there, that is the purpose, the testing and the exaltation of God's children. You could look at Moses. "This is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man." So to an ancient Israelite, and I would submit to you, to a modern temple-going Latter-day Saint, the creation accounts are about this. They are not so much about where we got mountains and how we got a fusing ball of gas as a sun and all that. Those are interesting questions, but they're not questions that Genesis sets out to answer. As Walton puts it, and Joseph Smith made the same point when he was discussing the Hebrew word bara, which means to create. This is Walton. "Though theological belief based on all of Scripture may affirm that God made all the matter of which the cosmos is composed, and that he made it out of nothing, lexical, that means word, analysis does not lend to the conclusion that Genesis is making such a statement by the use of bara. The origin of matter is what our societies taught us is important. Indeed, matter is all that there is. But we cannot afford to be distracted by our cultural ideas. Matter was not the concern of the author of Genesis. The author's concerns were much like those of the ancient Near East. There, the greatest exercise of the power of gods was not demonstrated in the manufacture of matter, but in the fixing of destinies." Well, pagan culture, as you know, had many idol gods. You see the Israelite ones, there's some Canaanite ones on the right, Babylonian on the right and Canaanite underneath. They had their own social pressures, the Israelites, and culture to resist just as we do. They were surrounded by pagans, and we all know how much they struggled with idolatry. That was basically the whole story of the Old Testament up until the Babylonian captivity. It's interesting to read Genesis and see how it says the same sorts of things that their neighbors believed in, and notice how it's different. These would be the sorts of things that they would notice, and probably point us to what it was intended to teach them. And if we can figure out what it was supposed to teach them, then it may teach us some things that we would otherwise miss. John Walton again. "In Israel, people also believed, as did pagans, that they had been created to serve God. The difference was that they saw humanity as having been given a priestly role in sacred space, rather than as slave labor to meet the needs of deity, the gods. God planted the garden to provide food for people, rather than people providing food for the gods. In Mesopotamia, the cosmos functions for the gods and in relation to them. People are an afterthought, seen as just another part of the cosmos that helps the gods function. In Israel, the cosmos functions for people and in relationship to them. God does not need the cosmos, but it is his temple. It functions for people." And I would add, and we, his people, are made kings and priests for him in that temple. So the temple talks about matter unorganized, and Genesis describes how the earth was without form and without void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of the God moved upon the face of the waters. Walton says this about that. In the ancient Near East, the pre-creation condition is therefore neither an abstraction nor personified. In Mesopotamia, chaos, that is, uncreated matter, unorganized matter, is personified only secondarily in the conflict myths that recount jeopardy to the created order. In this literature, the threatening creatures must be overthrown and order reestablished. So in Mesopotamian religion, there was chaos, and the gods had to impose order on it. And that's exactly what God in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Old Testament does. He starts out with matter unorganized, and he imposes his own order on it. Continuing with him, it would perhaps be best to use terminology such as pre-cosmic condition. How can we? Oh, right there. There? Sorry about that. The pre-cosmic condition was not lacking in that which was material, that is, there was matter, but it was lacking in order and differentiation. Clever boy, that Joseph Smith. Thus, the accounts regularly begin with a pre-cosmic, unordered, non-functional world. Creation then takes place by giving things order, function, and purpose, which is synonymous with giving them existence. Once established, the order that exists in the cosmos is constantly threatened with being undone. As a result, creation is not restricted to a one-time event. You can see that in King Benjamin. He talks about how God created us out of the dust, and he lends us breath from minute to minute, right? That at any moment we depend on God's goodness for our ongoing survival. It's the same kind of idea, that chaos is always pushing in, and only God's power holds it back. As a result, creation is not restricted to a one-time event. Whether the jeopardy derives from the cosmic waters, from what we would call natural occurrences, or from supernatural beings, from human behavior, or simply from the darkness of each night, the gods in the ancient Near East are responsible for establishing order day by day and moment to moment. That's an Egyptian chaos. That's the Nun, or Na, represented the primordial waters. Water in this culture was chaos. You couldn't control it. It was violent. It was unstructured. It was frightening. And there you see a woodcut from the 1600s. You can see the name of God in Hebrew up there, and he's pulling order out of the water at the bottom, out of the chaos. And Noah's flood was seen in just those terms. Here we go. So this is how the Hebrews thought about the world. You had the primeval ocean, that's chaos. You have earth in the middle of it. And then up top you have a solid dome called the firmament. And then there's water up above it. So the firmament holds back the chaos, and the earth holds back the chaos. That's why when Malachi says, "Prove me now herewith, if I will not open you up the windows of heaven," that's because that's literally how they thought of it. The water was up there, and if you're living in the Middle East and you need water for your crops, well, God's going to open the windows and the water's going to pour down. And that's probably why the gospel writers emphasize that Jesus can calm the waters. This isn't just a miracle story or ability. They're showing that Jesus can impose order on chaos, just as he did in the beginning of creation. This, like almost nothing else, demonstrates his link to God, or to being divine. And he can calm the chaos in our lives as a result. So the matter's unorganized. That might mean it has no physical form or shape, but it may also simply mean that it is merely matter. It has physical existence, but it is not yet serving a purpose for God's goal, which is the exaltation of his children. So he sets out to create, to organize a system or a process to accomplish his designs. And this is where the temple and the Genesis begin. Ontology, says Walton, that's a fancy word for existence, in the ancient world was more connected to function than to substance. In other words, something exists when it has a function, not when it takes up space or is a substance characterized by material properties. This applies to everything in the cosmos, where various elements come into being when they are given a role and function within the cosmos. That is creation in a Hebrew worldview. The neglect of curiosity about the physical structure of the cosmos among the ancient Hebrews and others is therefore not simply a consequence of their inability to investigate their physical world. These people weren't stupid. They were just worried about different things than we were. The physical aspects of the cosmos did not define its existence or its importance. They were merely the tools that the gods used for carrying out their purposes. The purposes of the gods were of prime interest to them. In the ancient world, to summarize, something came into existence when it was separated out as a distinct entity, given a function, and given a name. That is creation. So, with that in mind, let's look at the creation story. Day 1, light and darkness. People have often puzzled about this a great deal, because how do you make darkness? If there's no light, if there's nothing, well, isn't that pretty dark already? How do you divide light from nothing? But once you begin to see what kind of a creation we're talking about here, we realize that this isn't probably talking about the creation of light as a wave or a particle or a photon. Instead, it speaks of dividing a period of light from a period of darkness and labeling one of them day and one of them night. And it's called the first day. God is creating a stage, if you will, for mortality. And the first step in that process is to create a way of measuring time. Mortals are bound by time, by days and nights, weeks and years, seasons and centuries. And God is not. Number 2, back to this picture. The water and the land are separated. Remember that we began with the waters, which are chaos and matter unorganized. And it's all the same stuff. Here God pushes back the chaos and sets out a physical place or stage on which mortality will occur, complete with weather. He places the firmament, that's that solid dome for the sky, to hold the waters back from the earth. Remember, he's using their science and their understanding. So the stage is getting ready. Life needs a solid place to live and grow, and waters from above and below. Number 3, fertility and food. On day 3, God separates the non-living from the living. Remember, in Hebrew creation, you divide something, you differentiate it, you give it a purpose, and you give it a name. So we've taken chaos, and we've taken light and darkness and separated them. We've taken water and earth and separated them. Now we're going to separate living and non-living. He creates the non-living things and then the living. Plants grow from the earth, fruits and seeds, which are the basis of the food that all of us eat, including the ancient peoples. So the differentiation proceeds. You've gone from timeless chaos to timed order, and now from lifelessness to life. So to summarize, days 1 to 3, which concern the 3 core functions of the cosmos, time, weather, and fecundity, that's a fancy word for fertility or bringing forth, would consequently be viewed not as just activating, but establishing the control aspects of the cosmos. Day 4, the lights in the heavens. So people have puzzled about this. So on day 1, God creates light and darkness. Well, on day 4, he gets around to creating the sun, the moon, and the stars. That doesn't make much sense, does it? Where's the light coming from? Well, that's a logical scientific question to ask, but that's a weird question to ask. That's not what an Israelite wants to know. Remember, Israelites are living amongst and beside a pagan culture, and in most pagan cultures, the moon and the sun and the stars are divine. They are gods, and they're often very important gods. Here I have Ra, the Egyptian sun god, in his boat, right? I mean, they were a big part of pagan religion. But here in Genesis, the sun, the moon, and the stars aren't even part of the picture until creation is half over. That's a subtle but clear dig at those kind of ideas. And they aren't even given names. They're just called lights. And that's probably because the name of the sun and the moon and the stars was usually the names of gods to the pagans. So here they aren't even given names. They aren't even granted the dignity of it. They're just lights. They're given a purpose and a function by God, but they're certainly not worthy of worship or fear. Number 5, animals in the waters and birds. Well, that's a very weird combination of animals if you look at it from our scientific point of view. If you want to go with the conventional scientific pattern, life started in the water, then moved on to land, and the birds are latecomers to the party. And whales, which it also mentions, are relatively young, certainly long after land animals show up. But that isn't what Genesis is doing. Instead, there's more differentiation going on. Where do humans live? Well, we live on the earth, we live on the ground. And we don't live in the waters, and we don't live in the air. So first, God assigns a role. This is that separating again. He's separating the domains of life. There's water with fish and whales and all that we aren't really a part of. And there's air, there's birds, maybe insects, I don't know. And we don't live there either. He's working his way up. Okay? We might think of birds flying as being higher, but that's not how it is. As he divides and moves up, you increase in importance. Oops, I just blanked there. There we go. Oh, it's not getting knocked, sorry. Number 6, land animals and then humans. So we're getting close to humans, but we're still not there. Now we're onto the land animals. They're separated out, again, that division and separation. And then we get the creation of humanity. And humanity's role is to have dominion over everything, fish, birds, and land. Humans are set up as God's, the Hebrews would have said vice-regents, sub-kings. We would say stewards, probably, on earth. And remember, Adam even names the animals, which again is a godly function. He's helping with creation because he's naming them. He's giving them an identity and a place in the plan. So Walton concludes, days 4 to 6 could be seen as determining the destinies of the functionaries within the cosmos. When the destinies of the gods were determined in the ancient Near East, then powers and responsibilities could be delegated. So the sun rules the day for God. The moon rules the night for God. Humans rule the earth and its creatures for God. So again, their function and their purpose are what matters, not just the physical assembly of the bits and pieces. You'll remember that Adam is created from the dust of the earth. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return, God tells them. Many Mesopotamian myths had the gods form humans out of clay. But to an ancient audience, dust and clay are not the same sort of thing, even though they both sound like dirt to us. Walton again. Furthermore, one should notice that with regard to the non-divine ingredients from which living beings were made, there's a difference between clay and dust. In the ancient Near East, clay is a means to impose form on the body. Dust cannot be used the same way, since it's not able to be molded. Clay has significance for the artistic process. Clay is not explicitly connected to death in these works, that is, these pagan works, as dust is in Genesis. They may even have thought that the placenta was clayey, and so that was the leftover creation bits of the gods. But dust isn't fertile, and you can't shape it. It represents our connection to death. So again, that's giving quite a different message than their pagan neighbors would have had. Helaman, I think, gets this exactly right. Oh, how great is the nothingness of the children of men, yea, even they're less than the dust of the earth, he says. For behold, the dust of the earth moveth hither and thither, to dividing asunder, at the command of our great and everlasting God. Well, you're less than the dust of the earth. Why? Well, the dust of the earth at least does what it's told, and humans all too often don't. And finally, we get to Eve. Remember how we've been moving up the ladder. First plants, then animals outside of the human sphere, then land animals, then humans, i.e. Adam, and finally Eve. God creates by division and separation. So Eve is the crown of creation. Much has been written about Eve's creation from the rib of Adam, and President Spencer W. Kimball insisted that that was symbolic, not literal. And that is exactly what we're talking about here. And as you can see, scholars would certainly agree with that, because creation in Genesis of the temple isn't focused on physically making something, but on establishing their roles, their purposes, and their boundaries. Walton says of Eve, it should be noticed in this regard that in Genesis, the woman is technically built from the side of man. The word is usually architectural, and it's used anatomically only here in the Old Testament. Its anatomical use generally refers not just to bone, but to bones and flesh. One could ask then whether it was also true that all men and women are to be viewed as two sides of an original whole. All of this suggests that the dust rib element is significant not primarily for the individuals, but for the archetype, that is the symbol. Every man is made from dust, and every probably just on a timer. Ancient Near East anthropology suggests that Adam and Eve should be understood in archetypal terms, stressing the elements of connectivity that are inherent in their labels. All people are connected to the ground and are mortal, they're made of dust. All men and women are connected to one another, the rib, with stronger connectivity links than to mother and father. They become functional not only as images of God, but as beings interconnected to the cosmos, to God, and to one another. All of that should tell you why the law of chastity is so important. It should remind you why only a husband and wife united in marriage can achieve exaltation. Because they are complementary pairs. They are two sides of a whole. We have all, in Genesis, in a sense, been ripped apart, and we are not whole until we find that missing half. And it should remind you that anyone who harms a woman sins against the most important thing in creation, because she is the top of it all. Can't have a YSA talk without mentioning marriage, at least once, right? Day 7. We're almost there. This is where God rests. What would that mean to an ancient Hebrew, God rests? We tend to think of God, I think, sitting down and putting his feet up on the ottoman. Well, that's not how a Hebrew would have seen it. As developed earlier, rest does not imply relaxation, but more like achieving equilibrium and stability. He's making a place of rest for himself, a rest provided for by the completed cosmos. Inhabiting his resting place is the equivalent to being enthroned. It is connected to taking up his role as the sovereign ruler of the universe. The temple simply provides a symbolic reality for this concept. Psalms captures this, and the elements of the cosmos serve as functionaries for Yahweh's, that's God's, rule. Further confirmation exists in the presence of the Ark, that's the Ark of the Covenant, in the most sacred area of the temple, because it represented the footstool of God's throne. So a temple is a small-scale model of the universe, and the universe is what enthrones God. Without hesitation, then, he says, the ancient reader would conclude that this is a temple text. Again, clever boy, that Joseph Smith. He took this sort of stuff and stuck it back in the temple where it belonged. And that day 7 is the most important of the 7 days. In a material account, day 7 would have little role, right? I've made all the stuff, now I'm not making any more stuff, I'm done. But the true climax without which nothing else would make sense or have any meaning in this account. Because God rests in a temple and only in a temple. This is what temples are built for. We might even say that this is what a temple is, a place for divine rest. Perhaps even more significant in some texts, the construction of a temple is associated with cosmic creation. How does Joseph do it? Normal routines, once you're resting, quote unquote, can be established and enjoyed. For God, this means that the normal operations of the cosmos can be undertaken. This is more a matter of engagement without obstacles than disengagement without responsibilities. So I think God rests not in the sense that he takes time off or says, well, that's been a rough go. Instead, he says, the busy work has been done. Now we can get down to the main event, which is to fulfill his purpose. And if you intend the temple, this is exactly what happens. God announces they'll rest, but they don't disappear. God doesn't go away or not do anything or cease being involved. But instead, he comes and he instructs Adam and Eve, just as he does in Genesis. He gives them commandments, and the whole plan finally begins. You get down to business. And that should, I think, help you understand the Sabbath more fully. The Sabbath as a day of rest is not just a day to do nothing. It's to set aside the concerns and the worries and the duties that are involved in keeping the show running, worrying about food and clothing and jobs. You know, we need them, just as we need a planet with plants and animals and water and all the rest for a mortal life. But the point of them is something else. We don't live to work and eat. We work and eat to live and then do more important things. So on the Sabbath, we can fully dedicate ourselves to the purpose for which we're doing everything. So it's not a violation of the Sabbath for a bishop who may work harder on that day than any other day of the week to do the work that he does, because he's carrying out God's purposes on earth. And that matches precisely what the current church leaders have been telling us about the need to improve our Sabbath worship. They want us to remove some of those obstacles to our full engagement with God's work. Now, does all of this mean there was no literal Adam and Eve? No, of course not. But what it may mean, if Walton is right, is that we are taught about the creation in the Scriptures not so that we understand physics or geochemistry or biology, but so that we understand our situation. I would ask you to think about what's more important. And the real business of the temple starts when the creation or role assignment has gotten out of the way. The problem is that humanity, Adam and Eve, you and me, have been driven from the garden into a lone and dreary world. We're out of God's presence. Because where does God dwell? Well, he dwells in a temple, a cosmic temple. And the physical temples are to remind us of that. So when we go back to the temple, which you all can do for baptisms for the dead or for endowments or marriage, when we go back, in a very real and in a very literal way, you're going back to the garden. You're in God's waiting room, so to speak. We're back in his presence, even if it's only on a visitor's pass. You see a drama that explains how you got there, not how the physical stuff got made, which doesn't really matter, given the fix that we're in, but what our roles are. What's our point? Why are we here? What are we doing down here? What's the play? Not how is the stage made. Like Adam and Eve, we've all botched our roles in the play horribly. And so after a review of the history of how we got where we are, we in the temple then learn why the world is the way it is, because of sin and human weakness and separation from God's presence and the influence of Satan. And that's way more important than the particle wave theory of light. In the temple, you get to go back to God's presence. We make covenants that teach us how to remain there and remind us that the day is coming when Christ will return to the earth. And the earth is not going to be swept away when he comes back and we all go off in some never land to live in heaven. The earth, instead, will finally fulfill the purpose for which it was created, or the purpose for which it was purposed, if you follow Walton. We are to try to build Zion here, now, not in some never land, in some never time. You are to build it in the Lethbridge YSA stake. And that means you must, first of all, never forget who you are, and never forget the purposes for which you were created. And when I say you, I mean you as an individual and you as a group. You will find that you will reduce how much you sin by an enormous amount if you can remember these principles whenever you interact with other people. We would never mistreat anyone. We would never take advantage of anyone if we understood this, if we remembered the creation, the roles we've been given. Joseph Smith said this: "The earth, in its sanctified and immortal state, will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim to the inhabitants who dwell thereon, whereby all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be manifest to those who dwell on it, and this earth will be Christ's. And then it will have finally fulfilled its purpose, the point for which it was created. God will have done his work in glory in our behalf, and at that day every knee shall bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, God, and Messiah. And like on the seventh day of creation, we too will enter into his rest. But that will not be a rest of inactivity or sloth or sitting on clouds playing harps. But it will be doing the Father's will in behalf of others for eternities, worlds without end." Clever lad, that Joseph Smith. My prayers are with you. I'm grateful for the opportunity I've had to participate a bit in these sessions with you. I pray that you'll be safe, physically and spiritually. The church is true. Jesus is the Christ. Joseph was a prophet, and this is God's church. I know that, and I leave it to you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.